Okay?
Okay, you're good.
All right. I better take my mask down. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I want to welcome you all to the House of the Redeemer, and on this very special occasion that we can resume our concerts with the talented students of the Manus School of Music. So we're really celebrating today. And we're so happy to be able to be in this wonderful library, which was constructed in the early 1700s for the Duke of Urbino, and to house his bound books, which were a big thing in those days. And the library somehow was disappeared, and Edith Shepherd Fabry and her husband, Ernesto, who was Italian, decided to build an Italian Renaissance-style house for their residents in New York City, and they were able to obtain this library and bring it overseas. They brought it in 2 ships in case one was torpedoed. At least half would be remaining, and then they could reconstruct the other half. And so then in 1958, she decided to do something very special with this house and dedicated it as a house apart, a place apart for meditation and for prayer, for open to all faiths. And it still functions just as that, under the aegis of the Episcopal Church. And in the Episcopal Church, it's considered to be a peculiar. And so with that, I would like to introduce Pavlina, who will introduce the music this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot describe how excited we are to be back to this magnificent place. The last time we were here was in 2019, but then, thanks to the trustees and the executive director of the House of the Redeemer, Judy Counts, we had an online event when students were contributing videos. We had wonderful photos of the library, and we presented a concert about prominent European women composers. So even with the pandemic, we kept our wonderful partnership going. This is a very extraordinary, unique place. I would say one of the best hidden treasures of New York City. And we are so grateful to the House of the Redeemer, to Margaret German, to Judy Counts, for giving us the opportunity to share the talent of our extraordinary students. Now, I would like to introduce one of the very prominent theater directors who happens to be on the faculty of the College of Performing Arts, the new school, who is a great professor, and he's also our Vice Dean of Curriculum and Learning. One of his many specialties is Shakespeare, but in this particular instance, he proposed the project. It's entirely his project. He's curating it, and he will tell you all about it. At this point, Stephen Brown-Fried, the one and only. Before he tells you all the special things about the program, I want you to know that you should not be alarmed. All the students, all the performers, including myself and Professor Brown-Fried, have been rapid tested. We all tested negative. So while they're performing, they will not be using masks, but you're very, very safe.
Thank you.
Here you are.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pavlina. I now have to live up to that amazing introduction that you just gave me. And, I was thinking it could not possibly be more perfect that we are here in a room devoted to books for tonight's program, because what you're going to experience and hear tonight is taken from a book that many people consider the greatest novel written in the 20th century. Proust's In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past, as it's sometimes translated. Before we dive in, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Proust and the world that created him and what you're going to hear tonight so that we can situate it. The novel itself that this came from, In Search of Lost Time, I feel sometimes funny referring to it as a novel. It's actually 7 novels. It's over 3,000 pages. Don't worry, we're not going to perform them all tonight. What we're going to be doing is a brief, really an episode taken from the second half of the first book, which is Swann's Way. Before I get into, though, what happens in that little episode that we're going to perform tonight. So Proust, Marcel Proust, is born in 1871 on the western side of Paris. And the reason I mention when he's born, it's important that moment. Those who are familiar with their French history know that this was a major moment in French history because it was the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the fall of Napoleon III's government, and the beginning of what was known as the Third Republic, which would be the government that governed France up until the 1940s when Vichy France was instated during the Second World War. So Proust is born into this incredibly tumultuous time when France is really, in certain ways, redefining itself, and massive change is happening in France. The Prussian Empire took massive reparations at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. Specifically, they took the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. Why does that matter to us? Because if you were living in Alsace, you had to decide, am I Prussian or am I French? And those who decided I'm French started emigrating, as they already had, into Paris. And those included a large Jewish population, many industrialists who, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, were finding more wealth and opportunity and wanting to get connected to Paris. So we have in Paris, at the time that Proust is growing up, all of the social change happening. Also, because there's this influx of a Jewish migration, largely from Alsace, but also from other parts, we have the beginnings of anti-Semitism. And by the time Proust is beginning to develop this book, we're right in the middle of the Dreyfus affair. Alfred Dreyfus was among those who emigrated from the Alsace region in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. So all of this is going on in France at the time, and you have this genius of a young writer who is spending his entire life growing up wanting to write the great novel. As a young man, nobody thought that he was going to be the person to do it, because really as a young man, he was largely known as a social playboy. He got to know early in his life a woman who becomes very important, whose name was Geneviève Strauss. She was one of the women in Paris who ran one of the major salons of Paris where artists and writers would come together. Now, in terms of the influence of music on Proust, Geneviève Strauss's father, before she was Geneviève Strauss, she was Geneviève Halevi. Her father, Fromental Halevi, wrote the opera La Juive, that is rarely produced now, but some of you may be familiar with. She then, after her first marriage, is to somebody you may have heard of, Georges Bizet. So she marries Bizet, has a son, Jacques Bizet, who goes to school with a young Marcel Proust. They become fast friends, and it's through Jacques Bizet that Proust meets Geneviève Halevi Bizet Strauss. After Bizet died shortly after the very ill-received premiere of Carmen, and she remarried the Jewish attorney, lawyer, Emil Strauss, who was a friend of members of the Rothschild family, which was also present in France at the time. All of these people became the basis of the characters that Proust would write. Geneviève Halevi Bizet Strauss begins to inform Proust's Duchess de Guermantes, as well as Odette. Emile Strauss becomes the character Swann in the book, who you're going to hear about tonight. At these salons, also, we have all of the thinkers and writers of the era who are bringing the most pressing new ideas of the moment into Proust's head. Keep in mind, 1899, right when Proust was thinking about all the things that went into the book, Sigmund Freud publishes The Interpretation of Dreams. And so suddenly the world is beginning to think about what's going on inside our minds. How are we internally experiencing the stimuli that we're encountering all around us? And central to this also is our experience of music. What happens to us when we experience music? So the moment that you're going to hear tonight is taken from the first of the 7 novels that make up In Search of Lost Time, Swan's Way, from the second half of it, which is referred to as Swan in Love, because it details the progress and evolution of Swan's relationship with his wife, who's quite scandalous, Odette. Now, Swan, like Emil Strauss, had a Jewish background, and so though he was known by the highest monarchs of Europe, he always operates on the fringes of high society. In this scene, he comes to a party at the house of the Madame de Saint-Ouvert, who is throwing this musical salon. And one of the things that made me call up Pavlina on the phone was that Proust, in the writing of this scene, specifies details all of the pieces of music that are being performed in this salon scene. The scene itself is much, much longer than you'll hear tonight. We edited it down to make it something that we could fit into one evening. But as we were reading it, we thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful to actually experience this scene while hearing the music that was in Proust's head while he was writing this scene? He comes to this party. He comes without his wife, Odette. Why does he come alone? Because she's not welcome in these circles, because before she married him, it's known under the radar that she was previously a courtesan. So Odette doesn't come to these parties, but Swann comes alone and is able to talk to his friends there, specifically the Princess de Lome in the scene, who will go on in the book to become the Duchess de Guermantes. So I think that is all I'm going to tell. Well, oh, yes, thank you. Oh, yes. Pavlina reminded me, the most important thing that you're going to well, no, it's all important, but one of the many important things you'll hear is towards the end of this excerpt. After all of the pieces that get performed, that were actually known works that Proust was familiar with, Proust begins to describe a work that actually didn't exist, that he created for the purposes of the book, which is a sonata by this composer by the name of Vinteuil, who is a country gentleman in the town that Proust grows up in. And when Proust meets him as a young child, he never thinks that this man, Vinteuil, could create anything. And then in this section of the book, he explains to us how when Swann and Odette were first meeting at the salon of Madame Verdurin, Vinteuil was there and he began playing his sonata. And it was to the theme of that sonata that Swann and Odette initially fell in love. And then over the course of their love, they keep on hearing the Vinteuil sonata over, and he refers to the little phrase from the Vinteuil sonata. And it has the effect of reminding them of the entire progress of their love and the entire progress of their relationship. And over the course of this 3,000-page novel, this sonata continues to come back and come back and come back until the narrator, late in the novel, is hearing the entire symphony that Vinteuil wrote and is in awe of its complexity. So scholars have speculated as to what was the Vinteuil sonata that Proust had in mind. There are many, many theories. Some say it was a piece by Cézanne, some say it was the Franck's violin piano sonata, some say Brahms' sonata for piano and violin. You'll hear two of the options tonight, the Brahms and the Franck at the tail end. So they kind of bookend the section of the scene that really dives into the Vinteuil sonata. Did I get everything? Yes, okay. So here's my ask of you all. As you're experiencing it tonight, I beg, listen to the words of this marvelous scene and try to imagine yourself in this house in the 1890s, surrounded by this ball. And as you hear the music, imagine that you're experiencing this music and that you are perhaps Marcel Proust having this experience, putting together this scene through all of this wonderful material. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy.
It was at the Marquis de Saint-Ouvert, on the last for that season, of the evenings on which she invited people to listen to the musicians who would serve later on for her charity concerts. Swann had gone forward into the room under pressure from Madame de Saint-Auvert and in order to listen to an aria from Orfeo, which was being rendered on the flute.
Swann had taken up a position in a corner which, unfortunately, his horizon was bounded by two ladies of uncertain age seated side by side. the Marquise de Cambremer and the Vicomtesse de Franquetot, who, because they were cousins, used to spend their times at parties wandering through the rooms, each clutching her bag and followed by her daughter, hunting for one another like people at a railway station, and could never be at rest until they had reserved, by using their fans or handkerchiefs, 2 adjacent chairs. Madame de Cambremer, since she scarcely knew anyone, all the more glad for a companion, while Madame de Franquetot, who on the contrary was extremely popular, thought it effective and original to show all her fine friends that she preferred to their company that of an obscure country cousin with whom she had childish memories in common.
Filled with ironical melancholy, Swann watched them as they listened to the pianoforte intermezzo. Liszt's St. Francis preaching to the birds, which came after the flute, and followed the virtuoso in his dizzy flight. Madame de Franquetot anxiously, her eyes starting from her head as though the keys over which his fingers skipped with such agility were a series of trapezes, from any one of which he might come crashing 100 feet to the ground, stealing now and then a glance of astonishment and unbelief at her companion, as who should say,
"It is impossible. I would never have believed a human could do all that."
Madame de Cambremer, a woman who had received a sound musical education, beating time with her head, transformed for the nonce into the pendulum of a metronome, the sweep and rapidity of whose movements from one shoulder to the other so increased that at every moment her diamond earrings caught in the trimming of her bodice, and she was obliged to put straight the bunch of black grapes which she had in her hair, though without any interruption of her constantly accelerated motion.
At this moment, the Princess de Lome, who had not been expected to appear at Madame de Saint-Auvert's that evening, did in fact arrive. To show that she did not wish any special attention in a house which she had come by an act of condescension to be paid to her superior rank, she had entered the room with her arms pressed close to her sides, even when there was no crowd to be squeezed through, no one attempting to get past her. Staying purposely at the back with the air of being in her proper place, like a king who stands in the waiting procession at the doors of a theater where the management have not been warned of his coming, and strictly limiting her field of vision to the study of the pattern of the carpet or of her own skirt. She stood there on the spot which struck her as the most modest, and from which, as she very well knew, a cry of rapture from Madame de Saint-Auvert would extricate her as soon as her presence there was noticed, next to Madame de Cambermere, who, however, she did not know.
She observed the dumb show by which her neighbor was expressing her passion for music, but she refrained from copying it. She began to ask herself whether these gesticulations might not, perhaps, be a necessary concomitant of the piece of music that was being played, a piece which, it might be, was in a category from all the music that she had ever heard before, and whether to abstain from them was not a sign of her own inability to understand the music and of discourtesy towards the lady of the house, with the result that, in order to express by a compromise both of her contradictory inclinations in turn, at one moment she would merely straighten her shoulder straps or feel in her golden hair for the little balls of coral or of pink enamel, studying with a cold interest her impassioned neighbor, while at another she would beat time for a few bars with her fan, but so as not to forfeit her independence, she would beat a different time from the pianists.
When he had finished the Liszt intermezzo and had begun a prelude by Chopin, Madame de Cambermere turned to Madame de Franquetot with a tender smile, full of intimate reminiscence, as well as of satisfaction, that of a competent judge with the performance. She had been taught in her girlhood to fondle and cherish those long-necked, sinuous creatures, the phrases of Chopin, so free, so flexible, so tactile, which begin by reaching out and exploring far outside and away from the direction in which they started, far beyond the point which one might have expected them to reach. Phrases which divert themselves into those fantastic bypaths only to return more deliberately, with a more premeditated reprise, with more precision, as on a crystal bowl that reverberates to the point of exquisite agony to clutch at one's heart.
Brought up in a provincial household with few friends or visitors, hardly ever invited to a ball, Madame de Cambremer had fuddled her mind in the solitude of her old manor house, over setting the pace, now crawling slow, now passionate, whirling, breathless, for all those imaginary waltzing couples, gathering them like flowers, leaving the ballroom for a moment to listen, where the wind sighed among the pine trees on the shore of the lake, and seeing of a sudden advancing towards her, more different from anything one had ever dreamed of than earthly lovers are, a slender young man, whose voice was resonant and strange and false, in white gloves. But nowadays, the old-fashioned beauty of this music seemed to have become a trifle stale, having forfeited some years back the esteem of really musical people. It had lost its distinction and its charm, and even those whose taste was frankly bad had ceased to find in it more than a moderate pleasure to which they hardly liked to confess.
Madame de Cambremer cast a furtive glance behind her. She knew that her young daughter-in-law, full of respect of her new and noble family, except in such matters as related to the intellect, upon which, having got as far as harmony and the Greek alphabet, she was especially enlightened, despised Chopin, and felt quite ill when she heard him played. But finding herself free of the scrutiny of this Wagnerian, who was sitting at some distance in a group of her own contemporaries, Madame de Cambremer let herself drift upon a stream of exquisite memories and sensations.
The Princess de L'Homme was touched also. Though without any natural gift for music, she had received, some 15 years earlier, the instruction which a music mistress of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, a woman of genius who had been, towards the end of her life, reduced to penury, had started at 70 to give to the daughters and granddaughters of her old pupils. This lady was now dead, but her method, an echo of her charming touch, came to life now and then in the fingers of her pupils, even of those who had been, in other respects, quite mediocre, had given up music and hardly ever opened a piano. And so Madame de L'Homme could let her head sway to and fro, fully aware of the cause, with a perfect appreciation of the manner in which the pianist was rendering this prelude, since she knew it by heart. The closing notes of the phrase that he had begun sounded already on her lips, and she murmured, "How charming it is," with a stress on the opening consonants of the adjective, a token of her refinement by which she felt her lips so romantically compressed, like the petals of a beautiful budding flower, that she instinctively brought her eyes into harmony, illuminating them for a moment with a vague and sentimental gaze.
Meanwhile, Madame de Gallardon had arrived at the point of saying to herself how annoying it was that she had so few opportunities of meeting the Princess de L'Homme, for she meant to teach her a lesson by not acknowledging her bow. She did not know that her cousin was in the room.
A movement of Madame Franquetot had disclosed the princess. At once, Madame de Gallardon dashed towards her, upsetting all her neighbors.
Oriana!
At once, Madame de L'Homme looked with amused astonishment towards an invisible third, whom she seemed to call to witness that she had never authorized Madame de Gallardon to use her Christian name.
I should be so pleased if you would look in, just for a moment tomorrow night, to hear a quintet with the clarinet by Mozart. I should like to hear your opinion of it.
She seemed not so much to be issuing an invitation as to be asking a favor, and to want the princess's opinion of the Mozart quintet just as though it had been a dish invented by a new cook whose talent it was most important that an epicure should come to judge. But I know that quintet quite well. I can assure you now that I love it.
You know, my husband isn't doing quite well. It's his liver. He would like it so much to see you. Madame de Gallardon resumed. making it now a corporal work of charity for the princess to appear at her party.
Listen, and I'll explain. She began to Madame de Galadorn. Tomorrow evening, I must go to a friend of mine who has been pestering me to fix a day for ages. If she takes us to the theater afterwards, then I can't possibly come to you, much as I should love to. But if we just stay in the house, I know there won't be anyone else there, so I can slip away.
Tell me, have you seen your friend, Monsieur Swan?
No, my precious Charles, I never knew he was here. Where is he? I must catch his eye.
The pianist who was down to play 2 pieces by Chopin, after finishing the prelude, had at once attacked the Polonaise.
But once Madame de Galadorn had informed her cousin that Swann was in the room, Chopin himself might have risen from the grave and played all his works in turn without Madame de Lome paying him the slightest attention. She belonged to that one of the 2 divisions of the human race in which the untiring curiosity which the other half feels about the people whom it does not know is replaced by an unfailing interest in the people whom it does. Swann was extremely fond of the Princess des Laumes, and the sight of her recalled to him Guermantes, property close to Cambrai, and all that country which he so dearly loved and had ceased to visit, so as not to be separated from Odette.
Slipping into the manner, half artistic, half amorous, with which he could always manage to amuse the princess, a manner which came to him quite naturally whenever he dipped for a moment into the old social atmosphere, and wishing also to express in words, for his own satisfaction, the longing that he felt for the country.
"Ah!" he exclaimed, or rather intoned, in such a way as to be audible at once to Madame de Saint-Auvert, to whom he spoke, and to Madame des Laumes, for whom he was speaking. "Behold our charming princess! See, she has come up on purpose from Guermantes to hear St. Francis preach to the birds, and has only just had time, like a dear little titmouse, to go and pick a few little hips and haws and put them in her hair. There are even some drops of dew upon them still. A little of the hoarfrost which must be making the duchess down there shiver. It is very pretty indeed, my dear princess."
Swann and the princess had the same way of looking at the little things of life, the effect, if not the cause of which, was a close analogy between their modes of expression and even of pronunciation. This similarity was not striking because no two things could have been more unlike than their voices. But if one took the trouble to imagine Swann's utterances divested from the sonority that enwrapped them, of the mustache from under they emerged, one found that they were the same phrases, the same inflections, that they had the tone of the Guermantes set. On important matters, Swann and the princess had not an idea in common. But since Swann had become so melancholy and was always in a trembling condition that precedes a flood of tears, he had the same need to speak about his grief that a murderer has to tell one about his crime. And when he heard the princess say that life was a dreadful business, he felt as much comforted as if she had spoken to him of Odette.
Meanwhile, the concert had begun again, and Swann saw that he could not now go before the end of the new number. He suffered greatly from being shut up among all these people whose stupidity and absurdities wounded him all the more cruelly, since being ignorant of his love, incapable, had they known of it, of taking any interest or of doing more than smile at it as at some childish joke, or deplore it as an act of insanity, they made it appear to him in the aspect of a subjective state which existed for himself alone, whose reality there was nothing external to confirm. He suffered overwhelmingly, to the point at which even the sound of the instruments made him want to cry, from having to prolong his exile in this place, to which Odette would never come, in which no one, nothing, was aware of her existence, from which she was entirely absent.
But suddenly, it was as though she had entered, and this apparition tore him with such anguish that his hand rose impulsively to his heart. What had happened was that the violin had risen to a series of high notes, on which it rested as though expecting something, an expectancy which it prolonged without ceasing to hold on to the notes. In the exaltation with which it already saw the expected object approaching, and with a desperate effort to continue until its arrival, to welcome it before itself expired, to keep the way open for a moment longer, with all its remaining strength, that the stranger might enter in as one holds a door open that might otherwise close. And before Swann had had the time to understand what was happening, to think, it is the little phrase from Venturi's sonata. I mustn't listen. All of his memories of the days when Odette had been in love with him, which he had succeeded up until that evening in keeping invisible in the depths of his being, deceived by this sudden reflection of a season of love, whose sun, they suppose, had dawned again, had awakened from their slumber, had taken wing and risen to sing maddeningly in his ear, without pity for his present desolation, the forgotten strains of happiness. There are in the music of the violin, if one does not see the instrument itself and so cannot relate what one hears to its form, which modifies the fullness of the sound, accents which are so closely akin to those of certain contralto voices, the ones that one has the illusion that a singer has taken her place amid the orchestra. One raises one's eyes, one sees only the wooden case, magical as a Chinese box. But at moments, one is still tricked by the deceiving appeal of the siren. At times, too, one believes that one is listening to a captive spirit, struggling in the darkness of its masterful box, a box quivering with enchantment, like a devil immersed in a stoup of holy water. Sometimes again, it is in the air at large, like a pure and supernatural creature that reveals itself to the ear as it passes its invisible message.
As though the musicians were not nearly so much playing the little phrase as performing the rites on which it insisted before it would consent to appear, as proceeding to utter the incantations necessary to procure, and to prolong for a few moments the miracle of its apparition. Swann, who was no more able now to see it than if it had belonged to a world of ultraviolet light, who experienced something like the refreshing sense of a metamorphoses in the momentary blindness with which he had been struck as he approached it. Swann felt that it was present, like a protective goddess, a confidant of his love, who, so as to be able to come to him through the crowd and to draw him aside to speak to him, had disguised herself in this sweeping cloak of sound. And as she passed him, light, soothing, as softly murmured as the perfume of a flower, telling him what she had to say, every word of which he closely scanned, sorry to see them fly away so fast. He made involuntarily with his lips the motion of kissing, as it went by him, the harmonious, fleeting form.
He felt that he was no longer in exile and alone, since she, who addressed herself to him, spoke to him in a whisper of Odette. For he had no longer, as of old, the impression that Odette and he were not known to the little phrase. Had it not often been witness of their joys? True that as often it had warned them of their frailty. And indeed, whereas in that distant time he had divined an element of suffering in its smile, in its limpid and disillusioned intonation, tonight he found there rather the charm of a resignation that was almost gay. And Swann's thoughts were borne for the first time on a wave of pity and tenderness towards the Venturi, towards that unknown exalted brother who also must have suffered so greatly. What could his life have been? From the depths of what well of sorrow could he have drawn that godlike strength, that unlimited power of creation?
Audacity, Swann exclaimed to himself. The audacity of a Venturi-making experiment, discovering the secret laws that govern an unknown force, driving across a region unexplored towards the one possible goal, the invisible team in which he has placed his trust and which he never may discern. How charming the dialogue which Swann now heard between the piano and violin at the beginning of the last passage. The suppression of human speech, so far from letting fancy reign there uncontrolled, as one might have thought, had eliminated it altogether. Never was spoken language of such inflexible necessity. Never had it known questions so pertinent, such obvious replies. At first, the piano complained alone, like a bird deserted by its mate. The violin heard and answered it, as from a neighboring tree. It was at the first beginning of the world, as if there were not yet but these twain upon the earth, or rather in this world closed against all the rest, so fashioned by the logic of its creator that in it there should never be any but themselves. The world of this sonata. Was it a bird? Was it the soul, not yet made perfect, of the little phrase? Was it a fairy invisibly somewhere lamenting, whose plaint the piano heard and tenderly repeated? Its cries were so sudden that the violinist must snatch up his bow and race to catch them as they came. Marvelous bird. The violinist seemed to wish to charm, to tame, to woo, to win it.
Already it had passed into his soul. Already the little phrase which it evoked shook the medium's the body of the violinist. Possessed, indeed. Swann knew that the phrase was going to speak to him once again. And his personality was now so divided that the strain of waiting for the imminent moment when he would find himself face to face once more with the phrase convulsed him in one of those sobs that a fine line of poetry or a piece of alarming news will wring from us, not when we're alone, but when we repeat one or the other to a friend in whom we see ourselves like a third, whose probable emotion softens him. It reappeared, but this time to remain poised in the air, and to sport there for a moment only, as though immobile, and shortly to expire. And so Swann lost nothing of the precious time for which it lingered. It was still there, like an iridescent bubble that floats for a while unbroken, as a rainbow, when its brightness fades, seems to subside, then soars again, and before it is extinguished, is glorified with greater splendor than it had ever shown. So to the two colors which the phrase had hitherto allowed to appear, it added others now. Chords shot with every hue in the prism and made them sing.
Swann dared not move, and would have liked to compel all the other people in the room to remain still also, as if the slightest movement might embarrass the magic presence, supernatural, delicious, frail, that would so easily vanish. But no one, as it happened, dreamed of speaking. The ineffable utterance of one solitary man, absent, perhaps dead, Swann did not know whether Vinteuil were still alive, breathed out above the rites of those two hierophants, sufficed to arrest the attention of 300 minds, and made of that stage on which a soul was thus called into being one of the noblest altars on which a supernatural ceremony could be performed.
we would like to thank you very much for coming. You don't know what it means to us performers, finally, after a long time, because of the pandemic, we couldn't perform. How remarkable, how extraordinary the students were to keep on working, to keep on performing in their little rooms, on Zoom, working with their remarkable teachers, supported by a remarkable school. I am full of pride and admiration because of your dedication, because of the love for one of the most extraordinary things, the gifts we have, the gift of music, the gift of literature, the gift of art. And this brings to mind one of the most beautiful quotes by E.T.A. Hoffmann, a great writer who inspired many, many composers, many artists. He said, music is the most romantic of all arts because its subject is the infinite. Music discloses to men unknown realm, a world in which he leaves behind all definite feelings to surrender himself to inexpressible longing. This is what saved us during the pandemic. This was our greatest refuge, the world of music, the world of literature, the arts, the love and passion we have. And I would like to thank the people who are responsible for bringing this great talent to mass, our patrons. We have quite a few of them here. We have the vice president of the board of the College of Performing Arts, the one and only Bibi Broadwater. Because during this very, very challenging times, you helped us. You kept us going. You gave us the moral and financial support to achieve everything that we wanted to accomplish so that these students were not deprived of the opportunity to continue making the progress. We're deeply moved by your devotion to us, deeply. And we'll never can say enough thank you for what you are to us. And we want to. Last but not least, I would like to thank the House of the Redeemer, this magnificent place, this treasure. Margaret German, Judy Counts, the whole staff that has been welcoming us year after year. And we have something for you next year, but we're not going to tell you. It is going to be directed again by Professor Stephen Brown-Fried, and it's going to be again the marriage between literature and music, and it's very special. We wish you best of health. We wish you joy. We wish you a great spring and summer. Everything has to be spring and summer in our life. And million thanks, and let's keep this passion for what we love forever. Thank you.